So I'm very proud that we have with us today John Gall and Idit Weiß-Gal. Idit is a professor at Tel Aviv University at the School of Social Work. She was the head of the School of Social Work until 2021, and currently she serves as the head of the school's Human Rights and Policy Graduate Program. And John Gall, he's a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is at the School of Social Work and Social Welfare there. And both of them have published extensively on our topic. And very important publication was their latest book, which I brought with me today. It's When Social Workers Impact Policy and Don't Just Implement It. And that's also the title of the keynote. And I think what you're very well known for in the international discussion is that you really developed a very interesting framework to explain why and how social workers engage in policy. And we are very keen to hear what you will talk, what you will tell us today about this topic. So please come forward.
So, good morning, everyone, and we are very happy to be here in Cologne and to be able to participate in this conference. We have been closely following the DemSoz project from its inception and are very excited about its contribution to better understanding the policy role of social work here in Germany and elsewhere. The project is part of a very welcome and growing effort among social work educators and scholars in Germany to engage in discourse, research, and teaching that focus on the policy role of social workers. This is reflected not only in the innovating efforts of the DemSoz team, but also in the work of other German scholars in schools of social work across Germany and the German-speaking region, among them Miri Burzlaff, Dieter Kuhlke, and Stefan Kongeter. So Sigrid, Simone, and all the team, thank you very much for inviting us to this conference and providing us with the opportunity to contribute to the German discourse on the policy engagement of social workers. So thank you. Today we would like to share with you all a subject that has been the focus of much of our work over, I think, 3 or 4 decades, Johnny, already, and that we discuss in a book that has just been published. It is the role that social workers play in affecting the welfare state from below. More specifically, when, why, and how do social workers affect policies in order to improve the well-being and rights of disadvantaged groups that suffer from poverty, exclusion, and other social problems. In our lecture today, we want to present the policy engagement framework. We have formulated this framework over the last decade, based upon diverse theoretical and conceptual sources from social work and from other disciplines. Empirically, it draws upon our own research and that of other scholars. The goal of the policy engagement framework is to explain the level of engagement of social workers in diverse policy routes and the forms that it takes. In the framework, we concentrate on the factors that affect the policy engagement of individual social workers, be they professionals whose prime task is to deal with policy issues in their role as policy experts, or by frontline social workers, be they direct, clinical, or community social workers, whose prime professional task do not necessarily focus on actively engaging in the policy processes. We ask, what leads social workers who are located at the interface between the welfare state and citizens to seek to impact policy through diverse routes and varied type of action? What affects their decision to stand, to speak, and to act? And not only to implemented policies designed by others and that do not necessarily represent their service users' interests, rights, and well-being. So before describing the framework, let me provide you with a brief background to this discussion. Social work, as you said, has always regarded social justice as one of its key goals. Yet, in the past, efforts by social workers to further policy justice by affecting the social and structural factors that lead to disadvantage and poverty were often limited, and most social workers saw their role as one of implementing policies rather than initiating or changing them. It was only a small minority of social work leaders and activities who entered the political arena and sought to bring about social change. To a large degree and across the world, this is much less the case today. The profession's normative commitment to engage in social change is now much clearer and central to the social work discourse. Crucially, alongside the social work leaders and activists, there is much more evidence of social workers on the ground seeking to advance policy change through diverse routes. This is not always major, radical changes, but more often it takes the form of frontline social workers contributing to small, local changes that can nevertheless have a major impact on their service users. This process has been the subject of much thought-provoking research by scholars across the world. Indeed, a major contribution to this was the book recently published, edited by Ute, Simone, and Sigrid, in which they discuss the ways social work participates in the making of social policy. We seek to contribute to these courses through our policy engagement framework. So the policy engagement framework includes 4 categories of factors. 3 of them, opportunity, facilitation, and motivation, comprise of diverse variables that we think impact social workers' policy engagement directly. The 4th category, environments, affects these 3 categories. It has an indirect influence on the levels and forms of policy engagement of social workers, which is mediated by the other 3 categories. Now I will concentrate on the independent variable, what we would like to explain, the levels and forms of social workers' policy engagement. Over the years, we have been able to identify 6 different routes by which social workers impact policies on the organizational, local, regional, national, or federal levels. Each of these routes comprises of diverse activities by which social workers respond to social problems and policies. Research shows that social workers in different countries, in diverse fields and modes of practice, do indeed engage to one degree or another in all the 6 routes. 2 of these routes occur in the civic sphere, with social workers acting as citizens in the political process. The additional 4 routes are those in which social workers engage in the political process as professionals. The civic routes are voluntary political participation, such as voting or protesting. This is what we have been doing a lot in the last few weeks in Israel, and holding elected office. By holding elected office, whether at the local, state, or federal level, social workers become formal policy makers. Social workers engage in these routes, in these 2 routes, as private citizens and not in their formal capacity as professional social workers, although they are very important, okay? It's not saying that they are not important. It's the civic routes. The 4 professional routes include, firstly, street-level policy involvement. This professional route is unique in that it consists of social workers' involvement in impacting policy through their actions and decisions as frontline practitioners or as managers of social services. Social workers and the street-level organizations that employ them are pivotal policy players during the process of policy implementation by producing policy on the ground at the point of service delivery, when they change the policy, for example, when they bend the rules, okay? On the ground, frontline practitioners and managers may implement policy in a way that strays from its original intention and that affects the actual content of the policy. The second professional route is policy practice. We think of policy practice as one of our ongoing intentional professional activities. These are undertaken by social workers on their own initiative or that of others, but in order to impact the design of policy. The social workers engage in these activities as an integral part of their professional work in diverse fields and types of practice. For example, social workers who testified at federal, state, or local hearings on behalf of their service users. Social workers who organize their service users to engage in social action, or those that send emails to policymakers describing social problems or policy problems that harm their service users and that require policy change or a new policy. A third professional route is the way in which individual social workers engage in policy involvement through social work professional organizations. This can be by proxy, in other words, when the organizations represent their social worker members and engage in advocacy for policy change. Or the social work professional organization can serve as a recruitment networks which enable social workers to participate actively in the policy processes. Academic policy practice is the fourth professional route. It refers to the involvement of social work faculty and students in policy-related activities through university community partnerships, teaching, and or individual engagement of students or scholars. And now Johnny will describe the 4 categories of variable that we believe explain the why and the how of social work policy involvement in these 6 routes.
Okay, so, hi, let me begin with the first of the variable categories, which we call environments. A key insight we have taken from reactions to previous versions of our framework is that structural, social, and professional environments have a potential impact on the policy engagement of social workers undertaken through the different policy routes. This impact is difficult to entangle sometimes, but is clearly very important. So in the framework, we have four such environments. We call them welfare regime, policies and problems, the profession, and people. So I want to talk about two of the four environments very briefly. The first I'll talk about is policies and problems. Often in the social work literature, we find the implicit or explicit assumption that the severity of specific social problems or the nature of policies adopted to address these problems, think of austerity or new public management, will increase the motivation of social workers to engage in policy and will lead them to play a policy role in order to deal with a problem or to rectify the policy. And indeed, there is evidence that this has taken place. An early historical example, for example, is the terrible state of children in poor immigrant families in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. As Francisco Branco, our colleague, has shown, the severity of the conditions of children encouraged social workers to advocate for and eventually succeed in 1912 in bringing about the establishment of the Children's Bureau, which is really the first government agency in the world to focus specifically on the welfare of children. A more contemporary, and for us, at least for Idit and I, a very direct example is the role that social workers and particularly social work academics and the social work union have played in the recent protests against the anti-democratic policies of the extreme right-wing government that we now have in Israel. The head of the social work union was one of the first heads of a trade union to take a stand against these policies. Social workers in the field in Israel established an online social workers for democracy group, and social work faculty and students have been very active and outspoken in efforts to oppose the government's judicial overhaul, which was the first stage in this sort of anti-democratic process. So far, we have been successful and able to stop these policies, though it appears that the struggle to prevent Israel becoming another Hungary, Poland, or Turkey is, of course, far from over. So it is what we've been doing lately. Yet while severe social problems can and indeed do motivate social workers to engage more in policy, this is not always the case. Sometimes the reactions of social workers to these severe problems or the policies adopted to address them takes the form of apathy or sometimes even a sense of helplessness. The ways in which social workers reacted in the policy arena to the economic crisis and austerity during the Great Recession in 2008 reflects this. Research by our colleague Ricardo Guidi, who is here and will speak just a bit later on, and others, shows that this crisis led to a very significant and indeed remarkable mobilization for policy change among social workers in Spain, and it culminated in the so-called Orange Tide protests. However, in other Mediterranean welfare states in which harsh austerity policies were also adopted, in Greece, in Italy, in Portugal, there is little evidence of this type of mobilization. Our conclusion from this is that the severity of social problems and the nature of policies is an important environmental factor, but in of itself will not necessarily increase social workers' engagement in policy processes. Yet it may well have an impact if it is linked to other factors, and in particular to what we call the profession. Here the assumption is that when the social work profession and its representative body is strongly embedded in society, and its representative body this body attributes importance to policy engagement and structural solutions, and supports this through professional socialization and professional discourse, we are likely to find a more conducive environment for social workers' policy engagement. Societal recognition will create more opportunities for policy engagement. If social workers are able to attain leadership positions in social services, this will facilitate the participation of social work staff in policy processes. And due to encouragement and training in policy during their education and afterwards, social workers will be more motivated to engage in policy and have the self-efficacy to do so. Evidence of the impact of the profession on the policy engagement of social workers can be found in a series of cross-national comparative studies undertaken in the early years of the millennium by Mel Gray and her colleagues. Their study identified greater policy engagement among social workers in New Zealand in comparison to their colleagues in Australia, South Africa, and Hong Kong. The authors explained this by underscoring the more activist and structural approach adopted by the social work profession in New Zealand. Our own comparative work on policy practice also found a greater level of policy engagement by social workers in Spain, in Israel, and in the United States. These were also the countries in which a pro-policy engagement sentiment was most present in the professional discourse and the profession was most embedded in society. So I hope this brief discussion of the impact of environments offers you a sense of why we think context is important for better understanding why social workers engage in policy. Based on what we know, we are also convinced that environments are most potent when various environmental factors combine. In other words, when the environmental factors of welfare regime, policy and problems, the profession and people combine, the indirect effect on social workers' policy engagement will be greater. This will have a marked impact on the three other categories on opportunity, facilitation, and motivation. Our sense is that the uniqueness of the German case makes it a potentially fascinating case study to explore the role of environments and their combination on the factors that influence the policy engagement of social workers. Germany is a corporatist and federalist welfare state that delegates much of the responsibility for policy and the provision of social services to the state and local levels, and in particular to large non-state welfare associations. If we understand correctly, social work professional organizations are relatively weak, and training in policy in German schools of social work is in its infancy. And finally, the German debate on the political role of social workers is very distinctive and different from that in English-speaking countries and indeed in Israel, from where we come. All these factors in the German case combine to create an environmental context that is unique and that may create obstacles or possibilities for social workers' policy engagement. And of course, as we have heard, we know that the DemSoz project is exploring these issues. Now I want to move on to discuss the three categories that have a direct impact on social workers' policy engagement. Opportunity is the first of these three categories. Our point of departure here is that policy efforts are only possible if social workers have access to policy processes and to public policy institutions. This access issue will be crucial in determining if and how social workers affect policy. A notion that emerged within the social movement research, opportunity structures, helped to clarify our thinking in this context. It is not enough to want to impact policy. You need to have the option to access the places where policy is decided. Under what conditions do social workers have opportunities to access policy processes? How does this occur on different policy levels? Neo-institutionalism offers a useful way to answer these questions. It conceptualizes political and bureaucratic institutions as collections of rules and organizational processes. It is all about how things are decided and what is decided, but also who has the access to this process. Or to put it more crudely, social workers do this sometimes, who is at the table. So using these concepts, we explore opportunity on 3 levels of policy making in our book: the national, the local, and the street level, and ask, how do opportunity structures enable social workers to access the policy process at each of these levels? We observe that on the national level, different institutional rules and norms lead social workers seeking access to the policy process to adopt distinctive forms of policy engagement in different countries. So if they want to access the policy process, social workers in the United States will typically engage in lobbying on the state or the federal levels, often supported by their professional organizations such as the NASW. This reflects the rules and the norms of political institutions in the United States. In the UK, in the United Kingdom, by contrast, social workers often participate in green paper consultation processes. While in Israel, where we come from, access to the process is easiest for social workers through parliamentary committees. The norms and informal rules in these committees encourage external participation in them. And this explains the relatively high level of social work participation in these committees. The local level is where social workers are most likely to engage in the policy practice route to seek policy change. Here our perspective was much influenced by Vivian Lowndes' studies on local government in the UK, and in particular her employment of the term rules in use, which was first coined by neo-institutionalist Elinor Ostrom. This refers to a combination of formal and informal institutional rules that determine access and participation in local government policy processes. Our research on social work policy entrepreneurs revealed how social workers made use of their knowledge both of the formal rules regarding local policy processes, its hierarchy and formal structures, and of the informal ways in which policy is decided in a specific locality in order to further local policy change. When looking at the third policy level, street level policy engagement, we think of professional discretion as opportunity. In other words, we look at the policy processes that take place in a specific institutional context, that in which street level street level social workers have the capacity, either formally or informally, to engage in policy formulation within the social services in which they are employed. When they have this discretion, it enables them to affect the working of their organization and the lives of their service users in ways which are relatively unaffected by external actors, even those within local government. Given the nature of the welfare state structure in Germany and of its social services, an interesting question that emerges from this discussion is, what are the relevant policy formulation arenas, and what are the formal and informal rules and norms within them that can offer German social workers access to policy formulation processes? I don't have any answers. This is for you. Of course, not for me. Okay. So facilitation is the second of the direct variable categories that I want to talk about. It refers to the impact of the organizational context on social workers' policy engagement. So most social workers are employed in organizations. So it is fair to assume that the organizational context will have a predominant effect on their policy engagement. And indeed, a large volume of research within social work confirms this. How and why do organizations facilitate this engagement? And what form of policy engagement do they support? Well, a useful way to discuss facilitation is to think about the organizations in which social workers are employed as institutions. Institutions that are affected by policies decided upon by different levels of government. This is the case for non-profit, for-profit, and for governmental agencies on the national and local levels. These organizations and their employees impact policy processes to protect or further their specific interests and goals, and those of whom they serve. They will do so according to the rules and the norms existent in the policy process relevant to them. The organization's efforts to determine how and when their social work employees participate in policy processes will be reflected in what we call organizational culture. In our book, we explore the policy engagement of social workers in different types of organizations. But let me focus here on non-profit social service providers, which may be more relevant to the work of some of you here. Though the main goal of these organizations is to provide social services, in fact, they often engage in advocacy in order to maintain the support of state policymakers for their work, and at the same time in order to further the needs of their clients and other stakeholders. Clearly, creating the right balance between these two objectives is sometimes challenging. Not surprisingly then, when the leadership of these organizations adopt different forms of policy engagement, while they adopt different forms of policy engagement, they typically prefer what we call insider forms of advocacy. These often take the form of informal or formal meetings with policymakers. The leaders of non-profits are much more hesitant to adopt conflictual public activities which may alienate policymakers. This insider approach to policy engagement impacts also the organizational culture of non-profit service providers. Our own research and that of other colleagues in the United States and in Canada shows that these organizations often encourage their social worker employees to engage in policy to advocate for service users' rights or for government legitimacy. As a result, social workers employed in these organizations do indeed engage in policy practice, but the organizational culture relieves a distinct preference for non-conflictual policy engagement, and this is what characterizes the social workers' policy activities. So now I'll move on to the final category of factors, which we call motivation, and this relates to diverse individual characteristics that affect the motivation of individual social workers to engage in policy. The point of departure here is that social workers are, of course, individuals with agency, and thus, regardless of organizational support, opportunities, or environmental context, their decision to engage in a policy-related act will be influenced by their own unique characteristics that together create their motivation to do so. In our conceptual framework, we have tried to identify what our research and that of others tells us about the individual factors that impact social workers' engagement in policy through the different routes. The civic voluntarism model, which was formulated by Sidney Verba and his colleagues, explains the voluntary political participation of citizens. It still plays a well-deserved central role in the political science literature by underscoring the impact of personal resources, psychological engagement in politics, belonging to a recruitment network, and personal commitment to a specific issue or problem, how all that has an impact on people's political engagement. And indeed, this model has served as a very useful theory for explaining three of the routes through which social workers engage in policy: their voluntary political participation, their running for elected office, and their engagement in policy practice. Research has shown that social workers' engagement in these three routes is associated with the level of personal resources, such as policy skills, their level of psychological engagement in politics, such as the level of their policy efficacy and interest in politics, and the ways in which they were recruited to engage in politics by professional organizations. In recent years, scholars have moved beyond this attachment to the civic voluntarism model and explored additional personal characteristics that impact policy engagement. One such factor is social workers' personal values and professional attitudes, particularly with regard to the importance of policy engagement. This can, of course, be influenced by professional socialization, and that belongs to the professional factor that I discussed with regard to environment. The importance of values emerge in our studies on the reasons cited for policy practice among community workers. but it also emerged in work by other colleagues on the street level policy engagement of social workers. Another intriguing way to better understand social workers' policy motivation is to look at the role of personality traits. In a recent original contribution, Talia Schwartz-Tyree found that the willingness of social work students to engage in policy practice was significantly associated with some of the big 5 personality traits, particularly openness to experience, conscientiousness, and extroversion. Finally, initial research indicates that 2 additional, though very under-researched, sources of motivation are gender and ethnicity. Studies in the United States and Israel indicate that gender differences appear to impact the motivation of social workers to adopt different forms of policy engagement. Meanwhile, a growing body of work on the impact of ethnicity, much of it undertaken by our colleagues Hani Neumann and Faisal Azaiza, show that membership of an ethnic minority tends to lead to greater policy engagement, but that its contours are much impacted by the unique status and culture of that minority. We also discussed 2 other motivational factors in our book, but I think I'll end for now and let Idit say a few final words.
So, in the description of the framework, we noted the way environments provide the context and how opportunity facilitation and motivation affect social workers' policy engagement. However, we understand that reality is much more complex. So let me briefly discuss 2 interesting arrows in our framework. I refer to the arrow between motivation and opportunity and motivation to facilitation, okay? Our claim is that social workers have the agency to influence opportunities and specifically expand the opportunities for their policy engagement. So this is this arrow. In other words, social workers can affect the rules that determine the behavior of different policy actors in the policy-making processes. We saw this, for example, in a study that we undertaken in Israel on community social workers who were involved in policy practice at the local level. They did this by initiating changes in their access to policy formulation forums. For example, they convinced the mayor to set formal institutional rules that ensured the place of social workers in the discussion of specific subjects and norms and problems. In this case, the subject was citizen participation. Their demand was that social workers must be at the table. In other words, the social workers created new rules that widen their opportunities to be policy actors. In the same vein, social workers who are motivated to participate in policy processes can and indeed do affect facilitation. Thus, we know of how social workers, particularly within local social services, seek to convince the management in their agencies to enable them to engage in policy practice as part of their professional workload. This often reflects pressure by service users who need help in addressing pressing social problems. This is very exciting because here social work education, I think, has the major place or the major role to impact, to teach social work students how to do that. So, by way of conclusion, here is the depiction of the full conceptual framework, which include diverse variables. Some of them Johnny spoke about, but some of them are on the book, which include diverse variables. These are not close-ended lists, since we believe that there is much room for further research on each of these categories. Further studies are needed in order to reveal more environmental opportunities, facilitation, and motivational factors that have impact on the policy engagement of social workers, and also the inner association between them. So we don't know, it's hypothesis, but you need the younger generation, you need to give the evidence for these hypotheses. We believe that if we want policy engagement to be an integral part of what social workers can and should do, then we need to better understand what affects this. Hopefully, we have managed to show you that the policy engagement conceptual framework can contribute to moving these efforts forward. We hope that it can also contribute to your thinking about the policy role of social workers here in Germany. So now, thank you.